We're going to talk about settlers moving westward in the Fort Laramie Treaty. We did talk a little bit about this before, so some of it might sound familiar. As I mentioned, there were two areas of land that were considered very sacred to the Plains Indians. What were those? Burial grounds and hunting grounds. Very good. So their prime hunting grounds and their burial or spiritual grounds were very, very important to the Plains Indians. And they really were not territorial people concerning land so much, like land grabbers, but they were pretty territorial when it came to their hunting grounds and their burial grounds. And like we mentioned before, I believe, by the 1850s, more and more white settlers were traveling west across the Great Plains. Remember, they were going to California for the gold rush. The Mormons at that time, what they were called, were going to Utah. You also had other settlers that were moving to California, settling in Oregon, those types of things. And so during this movement westward, these settlers were traveling through those Indian prime hunting grounds and those spiritual areas. And this threatened two of the three of the Indians' way of life. So the Indians began to resist. We talked about this, the movement of white settlers westward. And they began to attack these white settlers going westward and killing these white settlers going westward. And finally in 1851, remember we told you the federal government had to step in and negotiate a treaty with 8 different Indian tribes. And we talked about this already. And the name of that treaty was the Fort Laramie Treaty. Do you remember what the Indians got out of that deal? Anybody? We talked about what the Indians get out of the Fort Laramie Treaty. What did we give them? Land. Who? They weren't interested in land. What? No.
What did they give them? Rice to send?
Come on, what did we give them?
Supplies.
Money. We gave them money. Remember, we gave them $50,000 a year. And what did they give us in return for that $50,000 a year? Right for settlers to move westward. And what else did we want to do to make sure that those settlers that moved westward had a place to stay in the winter or a place to rest along the way? Very good. We got permission to build forts. So by virtue of the Fort Laramie Treaty, we gave the Indian tribes $50,000 a year. By that way, that's about $1.6 million in today's money. We gave them $50,000 a year in exchange for the safety of settlers being able to move westward without being harassed or killed. And then we also got permission from those 8 Indian tribes to build forts along these western trails so that settlers that came through either in the winter or otherwise would have a place to stay. Now this Fort Laramie Treaty was signed, and we told you that it lasted 14 years, from 1851 until 1865. The government made these annual $50,000 payments. The Plains Indians held up their end of the agreement. They left our settlers that were going westward alone. They also let us build these forts along these western trails. But do you remember what happened in 1865 that changed things forever? Why did it become a problem? Why did the Indians not live up to their bargain after 1865? Not so much. No. What ended in 1865, kiddos? We talked about. Come on. Civil War. And how about all those Southerners that had absolutely nothing? They started to move, there you go, they started to move west, and all of a sudden, too many settlers started moving west. The Indians could handle a small amount of settlers going from 1851 to 1865, but thousands and thousands and thousands of settlers, especially from the southern states who were left with nothing after the Civil War, began to move south. And so by 1866, things began to change concerning the Fort Laramie Treaty. Well, as these settlers by the thousands moved west, what'd they go through? Indian burial grounds and Indian hunting grounds, and it caused a tremendous disruption to the Plains Indians' way of life. So 3 powerful Sioux Indian chiefs made the decision that they were no longer going to abide by the Fort Laramie Treaty. Okay? So in 1866, because of the heavy traffic that was coming westward after the Civil War, 3 specific Sioux Indian chiefs made the decision that they would no longer abide by the Fort Laramie Treaty. The $50,000 a year that the tribes were getting was not worth the hassle of all of these settlers coming through and disrupting their way of life. The 3 Sioux Indian chiefs I'm talking about were Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse, all on your ID sheet. So the 3 Sioux chiefs who made the decision they would no longer abide by the Fort Laramie Treaty were Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse. Now, beginning in 1866 until the late 1890s, almost 30 years, Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse and their Sioux warriors are going to continue to resist all westward movement into their burial and hunting grounds. 30 years this is going to go on. What do we call this in history? The Plains Indian War between the government and Plains Indians. And this thing lasted almost 30 years. So starting in 1866, when Sioux Indian chiefs Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse made the decision they would no longer abide by the Fort Laramie Treaty, from 1866 until the late 1890s, Native Americans or Plains Indians are going to continue to resist against this westward movement. And this particular event is known in American history as the Plains Indian War. Plains Indians War. Anybody, you probably know the most famous part of the Plains Indian War happened in June of 1876. What was that? Southeastern Montana, known as the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Okay, so we'll talk about that later, but that's just the biggest example of what people remember the most about the Plains Indian Wars. Now, something happened before the Little Bighorn that set the stage for that. Anybody know where that happened? Where the Indians got a big-time massacre victory over the whites? Fort Phil Kearny, right? Near Sheridan, Wyoming. And a story. And in 1866, an Indian victory at Fort Phil Kearny is going to set the stage for what will become the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Okay? So we're starting to see resistance, and this resistance is going to continue now after the Civil War until the 1890s, and it's going to be known as the Plains Indian War. And probably the biggest significant battle in that everybody remembers is the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where General George Armstrong Custer and his forces were massacred, or depending on your side of the story, by thousands of Plains Indians in southeastern Montana. Now, let's talk about building forts along the Bozeman Trail. That was part of the deal, right? So we're kind of backing up a little bit, and we're talking about these forts that were built along the Bozeman Trail that were allowable by the Fort Laramie Treaty. That because we signed that, we could do that. Okay? Now, this trail westward is best known as the Bozeman Trail. Okay? So again, as part of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, the federal government had permission to build forts along the western trails. Probably the most famous of the western trails was the Bozeman Trail. And it does go by present-day Bozeman, Montana, but it's a long, long trail. If you ever visit Fort Phil Kearny and go to the certain area of the battlefield, which we'll talk about, you can still see wagon tracks from the Bozeman Trail. Now, what is the Bozeman Trail? It was a route from Fort Laramie in the Wyoming Territory to Virginia City in the Montana Territory. So you're looking from here up into here. So it's a trail from here up into Montana here, okay? The Bozeman Trail was a trail that went from Fort Laramie, self-explanatory, in the Wyoming Territory, located where, obviously, Laramie, Wyoming, to Virginia City in the Montana Territory. Now, I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with Montana geography, but you ever heard of Ennis, Montana? Okay, West Yellowstone, okay, in that area. Anyway, that's what the Bozeman Trail, that's where it went. Now, a lot of these guys that were going from Fort Laramie along the Bozeman Trail into Montana were going there to look for what? What? Nope. They're going to travel the fields all the way from Laramie, Wyoming to above Bozeman, Montana in search of what? Gold. Very good, gold, because there were gold fields in Montana located in 3 specific Montana cities. Virginia City, which still exists as a tourist trap now, it's not really much of a city. Nevada City, which is just a few miles from Virginia City, which again is just kind of a tourist trap now. And a place near Dillon, Montana, in southwestern Montana known as Bannack, B-A-N-N-A-C-K. So the 3 areas that settlers were traveling from Fort Laramie along the Bozeman Trail were, they were going to Virginia City looking for gold, they were going to Nevada City looking for gold, which were kind of the same area, and then they were going all the way over here to Bannack, in this area here, Bannack, in southwestern Montana. Those were the big gold mining towns back in the 1860s, okay? Well, the Sioux Indians began to resist this movement. And so, you remember Civil War General John Pope? We talked about John Pope. He lost the Second Battle of Bull Run for the Union. He got orders from Washington, D.C. to establish 3 forts along the Bozeman Trail to provide protection for these settlers that were moving from Fort Laramie to the gold fields of Montana at Nevada City, Virginia City, and Bannack. So, former Civil War General John Pope, who was the commander of Union forces who lost at the Second Bull Run, was given orders from Washington, D.C. to establish 3 forts along the Bozeman Trail. And again, we mentioned this, the 2 purposes of the forts were to provide protection for the white settlers that were traveling the Bozeman Trail, which means they'll be equipped with what? Military personnel, right? Troops. And the second purpose is to provide winter quarters for these settlers traveling the Bozeman Trail so they wouldn't get caught in the winter like the Donner Party did, okay? So these 3 forts that were to be built on the Bozeman Trail were built for 2 specific reasons. One, to provide protection to the white settlers that were traveling the Bozeman Trail, which meant these forts are military posts with soldiers. And second, the purpose behind building the fort was to provide winter quarters for the settlers that were traveling the Bozeman Trail so they wouldn't be out stranded in the winter months. Now, the only one we're going to talk about is located in the northern part of the Wyoming Territory at the time, and it was named Fort Phil Kearny. Who was it named after?
Phil Kearny.
When's the last time we talked about W.W. Kearny? What? Mexican War. Very good. He was one of the commanders that took Santa Fe, right? Went on. Okay. So this Fort Phil Kearny that is named in Wyoming is named after Mexican War General Phil Kearny. Remember, he won at Santa Fe in New Mexico and San Diego in California. Anybody been to Story, Wyoming? Anybody know the geography of Story? There's 2 creeks there. There's the Big Piney Creek and the Little Piney Creek. And Fort Phil Kearny is built along both of those creeks near Story, Wyoming. If you go to Sheridan, it's just a few miles past Sheridan. Okay, is what we're talking about here. And again, that fort was built on the banks of Big Piney Creek and Little Piney Creek near Story, Wyoming. Big part of your test will be this Phil Kearny, so Fort Kearny, so get it right. Now, obviously, Fort Phil Kearny's got to be built, right? We'll talk about that. But there's going to be a military presence there, right? And the military presence at Fort Phil Kearny will be the United States Army 18th Regiment. The United States Army 18th Regiment. will be the soldiers inhabiting Fort Phil Kearny. United States Army 18th Regiment. And they're going to have a commander, right? And that commander is going to be Colonel Henry B. Carrington, who's on your ID sheet. Henry B. Carrington. So again, I'll back up a little bit. Fort Phil Kearny will be built along the Big Piney Creek and the Little Piney Creek near Story, Wyoming. Fort Phil Kearny would be inhabited by the United States Army 18th Regiment under the command of Colonel Henry B. Carrington. So, somebody had to choose the site for the fort. Who chose that?
Bill Kearny.
What?
Bill Kearny.
No, he's out of the picture.
Oh,
Just named him.
Henry D.
That's right. Henry B. Carrington is going to have the responsibility to choose the site for this fort. So who does he enlist to help him do that?
Jim Bridger.
Famous Western scout Jim Bridger is going to help Colonel Carrington pick a good spot for this construction of Fort Phil Kearny. They're going to have to build this. This isn't just going to metamorphosize out of nothing. It's got to be built. So Carrington's been given the job of commanding this particular fort, but he's also given the job of picking the site and who's going to build the fort. The United States Army 18th Regiment and some civilians, which we'll talk about. Okay? And he enlists the help of famous Western scout Jim Bridger. Well, finally they look, and Colonel Carrington picks a location of the fort, which was not endorsed by Jim Bridger. What does that mean? He not approved. He didn't think it was the best spot. Now, guys, pay attention here, because this might affect you someday. So, Colonel Henry B. Carrington picks the spot that they will construct Fort Phil Kearny on. And even though he enlists Jim Bridger for his advice, he goes against the advice. It's kind of like if you hire a lawyer and pay him a lot of money and he gives you advice that this would be in your best interest and you choose not to take his advice, that seems a little silly. So he hires Jim Bridger to help him find the perfect spot for this fort, and the spot he picks is not endorsed. And the reason why Jim Bridger didn't like the spot is he thought that the local hostile Indians that were in the area would become a problem both during and after the construction of the fort. He had scouted out, there were some hostile Indians there that were not interested in any fort being built in their burial and spiritual grounds. And he didn't think that was a very good spot. Well, Bridger's going to be correct, and we'll talk about that later. Bridger is going to be correct. So let me ask you a question, Cesar. Why in the world would Henry B. Carrington pick a spot that Jim Bridger thought was a poor spot, who's an expert scout, who says to Carrington, I don't think this is a very good spot because I think the hostile Indians in this area are going to cause you trouble, not only when you build that fort, but after it's completed, they're going to harass you the whole time. Why would he do that? That's a good guess, not bad, but no, it was simpler than that. He had somebody to please. Who do you have to please? What? What'd you say? Well, he had one. He had to please his wife. She got tired of looking for a spot. She liked that spot, thought that spot was really pretty, and so he picked that spot because that's what his wife wanted, because she was tired of looking. She chose the site because she liked the beauty of the area and she was tired of traveling around and did not want to go look for another location. See what's going to happen to you, fellas? Someday, it's like when I built my first house with my wife. You know what I did the whole time when we built our first house? Wrote the checks. That was it. You leave everything else to the wife. Yeah, see, writing the checks and letting your mom go crazy. Yeah, that's what you do. Well, Colonel Carrington had to live with Mrs. Carrington. She was tired of traveling around, and she really thought that was a beautiful place, so he said, okay, not a good choice. And we'll get into that later. Okay? So we've got a spot. What do they got to do now? Build it. Well, here's part of the problem. Colonel Carrington, his command had morale problems. What does that mean if you have morale problems? If this class has morale problems, and maybe we do,
We don't get along.
that means you don't get along, nobody really wants to be here. It's the worst bane of your existence to have to come in here every day, and you think that the history teacher just doesn't have a clue. Okay? Could be true. But what the U.S. Army 18th Regiment thought was that Carrington was too soft, too hesitant to attack the Indians, kind of too big of a pansy. And they didn't respect him much, so morale was pretty low among the U.S. Army 18th Regiment when they got to that area to build, because they didn't have a lot of respect for Carrington because they thought he was kind of wimpy. They thought he was too soft. Because Carrington had had a reputation of being hesitant to engage hostile Indians. He always believed he didn't have enough men and he didn't have enough horses to ever engage. Okay? Well, I can tell you for sure that this construction of Fort Phil Kearny is going to be seen by those local Indian tribes as a disruption of their way of life. And this idea of building a fort on Indian land was despised by 3 particular Indian tribes who inhabited the area. Anybody want to guess what 3 tribes they would have been? What? Nope. No, they're northern Montana. Sioux?
Blackfoot.
No, they're in northern Montana.
Oh.
Sioux, Cheyenne,
Shoshone.
and Arapaho. Okay? And I'll spell Arapaho. So, Sioux Indians inhabited that area. Cheyenne Indians